Okay, so for the second video of this topic, we will talk about thermoregulation. So the anterior hypothalamic preoptic area contains cold and sensitive neurons. So we consider this the central thermoreceptor. So thermoreceptor, as you know, are the receptors in our body that detect temperature changes. So if you can see here, the area in the hypothalamus is the anterior hypothalamic and the preoptic area. We also have peripheral thermoreceptors that are located in deep body tissues such as the abdomen, the viscera, and the spinal cord, and they also have some in the skin surface. So these are the peripheral thermoreceptors. So the signals from the central and peripheral thermoreceptors are integrated in the hypothalamus. So this is one of the main function of the hypothalamus is to regulate the temperature. This is associated with other center, the hypothalamus like your drinking center. All of those are important in maintaining the homeostasis of our body. So the hypothalamus will integrate all of this signal and it will cause the body to produce suitable heat altering mechanism. So which is the one is required by the body at that moment. So if the temperature of the environment is very high, then our body will produce heat altering mechanism to reduce the body temperature. And it's the opposite when the environmental temperature is low. So, as an example, in pseudomotor response, so pseudomotor response is the sweat gland response. So, it is the response for sweating. So, the afferent signal from the hypothalamus after the processing all the information from your peripheral and central thermoreceptor travel to the pons and the medulla and reach the spinal cord. And the neurons from the ventral horn of the spinal cord will synapse with the sympathetic ganglia of your autonomic nervous system. So this is the start of your autonomic nervous system for sweating. So the postganglionic non-myelinated C fibers of the autonomic nervous system will travel and combine with the peripheral nerve before reach the sweat gland. And if required sweating, then it will stimulate the sweat gland to produce sweat. So we'll discuss this in detail later in this video. So this is an example of pseudomotor response, sweat gland response, which is one of the mechanism to control the body temperature. So sweat is produced when required. So it's a result of the pseudomotor response. So the response to increased temperature and the response to decreased temperature of the environment, we can see there are a few of them. So as the normal one is increased sweating for increased temperature and decreased sweating for decreased temperature. And so you have the vasodilation. We discussed in the previous video, the blood vessel constriction and the blood vessel dilation play a major role in removing the heat generated inside our body. So vasodilate means the blood is nearer to the skin, so more heat can be removed from the body. Vasoconstriction is opposite. And again, metabolic rate, which is the main production of heat in our body. So if the temperature increase, we reduce the metabolic rate and increase the metabolic rate if we are in cold environment. For decreased temperature, they also have piloerection, which is the hair in our body. They will erect to produce the insulation zone. And also shivering. And the lastly is behavioral changes that can occur in increased temperature or decreased temperature. So behavioral change like drinking more water, stay inside the room, turn on your fan, or in decreased temperature, that means you wear more layer of clothes that is more appropriate for cold environment. So these are behavioral changes. That's also included in the response to changes in temperature. And in the infant, we will discuss a little bit later, you have this mechanism of brown adipose tissue, only in infants. So sweating. Sweating is activation of the sympathetic nervous system. So I think you're all aware of this. So the increase heat loss through evaporation, which is the only method when we are in a hot environment. But one thing that you need to be aware is the innervation is by the cholinergic sympathetic fiber, not the usual adrenergic. So when this happens, it is allowed the sweating to occur even when other adrenergic sympathetic system are inhibited, because sweating are one of the few mechanism in our body where the sympathetic function is by the cholinergic neurotransmitter rather than your adrenergic. So when the body shut down most of the adrenergic sympathetic system, the cholinergic system of sweating can still work. So blood vessel, we discussed before, and you also know that the sympathetic nervous system also cause vasodilation, again with the cholinergic pathway rather than adrenergic. So this flow near the skin to remove it from the body. Vasoconstriction is by the adrenergic sympathetic nervous system. So farther from the skin, they prevent heat loss that is generated deep in our body through cell metabolism. Metabolic rate, it can be increased. Sometimes we call it chemical thermogenesis or non-shivering thermogenesis. So this is what we call increasing thermogenesis through metabolic rate. It's a rapid short-term increase in metabolic rate due to sympathetic stimulation and increase in circulation of epinephrine and norepinephrine hormone. This you will cover in next course, which is course of endocrine. You will learn more regarding the epinephrine and norepinephrine hormone. So if you not quite understand how this hormone increase metabolic rate, you don't need to worry. You will learn in detail in the next course. Piloration is the stand up of the hair on your skin. So hair raising, sometimes we call it goosebump. So it's also a sympathetic stimulation, causing the erectile pili muscle of the hair follicles to contract, and this will entrap air around the skin to act as insulator zone to prevent heat loss. So if you remember your convection, where you remove the warm air from your body so that the new colder air can come in contact with the skin. So when you have this insulator zone, it will prevent heat loss because you trap the air within the hair. So they cannot be removed through convection unless it is a very strong wind. So, but this is more important in animals than human. I think you're aware of this. But in human also, you have your piloerection. Sympathetic nervous system in thermoregulation as a whole, we discussed 2 or 3 points before. So is involved in both decreasing and increasing temperature. So both involve sympathetic rather than usually when we talk about autonomic nervous system, one system is one effect is sympathetic and the opposite effect is parasympathetic. But with regards to thermoregulation, the decreasing and increasing of temperature both are under the sympathetic nervous system. The difference are because the decreasing in temperature, we use cholinergic sympathetic neurons, which is for vasodilation and sweating. The increase, we use the adrenergic. So make sure you know, cholinergic in this case, still sympathetic, not parasympathetic. So vasodilation also involves many other mechanisms. And when you learn during your cardiovascular course and what's not, there's a lot of other function that can affect vasodilation. Shivering. Primary motor center of shivering is located at the dorsal medial portion of the posterior hypothalamus. So again, hypothalamus is important part of the brain to control temperature. Normally it's inhibited. So when the temperature is normal, normally you and I, we do not shiver. So normally they are inhibited. So when the body temperature drop, the signals sent to the anterior motor neuron. So increase in muscle tone causing shivering. So we call it shivering thermogenesis as opposed to non-shivering from the basal metabolic rate. So this image is quite a good summation of how our body do thermoregulation. So as I mentioned before, you have your central thermoreceptor and you have your peripheral thermoreceptor. So both send signal to the hypothalamus, and from the hypothalamus, you go to the pons and the medulla, to the spinal cord, and to the ANS, particularly your sympathetic. So depends on whether you want to respond to hot temperature or you want to respond to cold temperature, then you have this mechanism for reduction of temperature and for increased temperature. So you have your sweating. So this is your cholinergic, sympathetic. Same with your vasodilation. Your vasoconstriction, you have your adrenergic. And brown nervous tissue, we will discuss later. And this is your somatic muscle for your shivering thermogenesis. So these are the good summation of how the body do thermoregulation. Behavioral changes, as I mentioned before, as the last point when we talk about thermoregulation, appropriate adjustment to temperature changes, including your eating, drinking habits, which, if you know, eating and drinking, both the center are at the hypothalamus. So it makes sense when you think about it. So involve daily activities, your clothing, and moving to more appropriate environment. So these are behavioral changes. So most changes that I talked just now, those are short-term changes. So we talk about sweating, very short-term changes in thermoregulation. The same with shivering. You cannot shiver for 1 week. You cannot shiver for full 1 day. The same as sweating. If you're sweating continuously for 1 day, then you become totally dehydrated. Your electrolyte become imbalanced. So those are not practical long-term changes. There are only a few long-term changes that can help us adapt with both environmental temperature. So, the first one is sweating long-term adaptation. So the rate of sweat production increases when we stay in high temperature. So you all know this. This is the evaporation principle. So to prevent excessive salt loss through sweating, the body adapts by reducing the amount of salt in sweat. So salt is important because it is your electrolytes, right? So if you lose too much electrolyte, then it will become imbalance. So if we suddenly move to a area where the environment is hot, the body needs to adapt to preserve the electrolyte in our body. So the amount of sweat might be the same or increase because increase of the evaporation mechanism, but the body will try to reduce the amount of salt in the sweat. So usually happen after 4 weeks. So if you say stay in a hot environment for 1 month, usually the body will start to adapt. So how they do this is due to the increasing the secretion of aldosterone, which is a hormone. So this will reduce the amount of salt loss through sweat. So for aldosterone, again, we will cover in the endocrine cause. So for this, you just need to know they are involved in long-term adaptation of thermoregulation. How they do it, we will discuss next course. So another thing is by increasing the release of thyroxine releasing hormone. Again, this is for endocrine hormone. So we'll cover in next course. Again, around 4 weeks. So this is when we are in cold environment. So the production of thyroid hormone or thyroxine from the thyroid gland and thyroid, for now, you need to know they are involved in cell metabolism. So more thyroid hormone means increased cell metabolism. That means increased heat generation. So this is the long-term changes that the body can do in cold environment. So in newborn, we mentioned before the brown adipose tissue. Newborns are susceptible to hypothermia because the hypothalamus and thermoregulation center is not fully developed yet. So they lack the shivering mechanism as well. So all of these thermoregulation and the, the shivering thermogenesis, infant, newborns, they cannot do it well because it's not fully developed yet. So they are also more prone to heat loss because the evaporation due to skin immaturity and elevated ratio to body surface to it. That means they are more exposed to the environment. So they lost heat faster relatively when we compare to adults. So they are more at risk to become hypothermic. So lack of insulation due to subcutaneous adipose tissue also increase the risk of become hypothermic. So in this case, the body have the non-shivering thermogenesis through the metabolization of what we call the brown adipose tissue. So this is quite a specific adipose tissue that produce heat instead of ATP when metabolized. So they do not produce energy, but they produce heat. So this will help newborn to maintain their body temperature. When the other thermoregulation mechanism is not fully developed and their body lose more heat when compared to adult. So adults, they do not depend on the brown adipose tissue for thermoregulation. Only in newborn, usually 6 months old or less. So that's all for the second video. In the next video, we will talk about abnormalities in temperature regulation. So I'll see you next time. Thank you.